At first, no one really notices it happening. It doesn't come with a loud announcement or a dramatic shift. It happens quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. The avoidant person who once seemed independent, mysterious, and emotionally controlled begins to change in ways that even they don't fully understand. In their younger years, distance felt like power, silence felt like control, not needing anyone felt like strength. And for a while, it even worked. They could walk away from conflict, avoid emotional conversations, keep their feelings hidden, and still feel like they were in charge of their own world. But time does something to avoidance. It doesn't soften it, it hardens it. What once felt like a protective shield slowly becomes a permanent wall, and the longer that wall stays up, the more difficult it becomes to tear it down. As the years pass, the avoidant doesn't just stay the same. They often become more rigid, more distant, more emotionally guarded. Not because they want to hurt others, and not because they enjoy being alone, but because their way of coping becomes deeply ingrained. Avoidance becomes familiar, and what is familiar always feels safer than what is unknown. In the beginning, their independence looks admirable. They seem calm in situations that make others emotional. They appear strong when others feel vulnerable. They don't chase, they don't beg, they don't cling, and people often mistake this emotional distance for maturity. But what many don't see is the quiet discomfort underneath that calm exterior. Emotional closeness doesn't feel safe to them. It feels unpredictable. It feels like something that could trap them, overwhelm them, or expose parts of themselves they'd rather keep hidden. So they learn to keep a comfortable distance. And at first, that distance feels like freedom. They can leave when things get too intense. They can shut down when conversations get too emotional. They can disappear into work, hobbies, routines, or solitude whenever connection starts to feel like pressure. And because this strategy protects them from discomfort, their mind slowly reinforces the belief that distance equals safety. But here's what time does. Every time they choose distance over closeness, their brain learns that avoidance works. Every time they shut down instead of opening up, their nervous system becomes more accustomed to emotional silence. Every time they walk away instead of working through something, it becomes easier to do it again. What starts as a coping mechanism slowly becomes a lifestyle. And as the years pass, the emotional muscles they never used begin to weaken. Vulnerability feels more foreign. Deep conversations feel more exhausting. Emotional risks feel more dangerous. The world of connection, intimacy, and closeness begins to feel like a place they don't belong anymore. As they grow older, something subtle starts to shift. It becomes harder to feel excited about relationships. The idea of opening up doesn't feel romantic or thrilling, it feels tiring. They start to see emotional expression as unnecessary drama. They convince themselves that most people are too needy, too emotional, too complicated, and this belief helps them justify their distance. It becomes easier to say, "I just like my space," than to admit, "Closeness scares me." Over time, this mindset becomes more rigid. They stop giving people chances. They stop being curious about emotional connection. They stop asking themselves what could happen if they let someone in. Instead, they focus on maintaining control, predictability, and distance. And that's when independence slowly turns into isolation. At first, solitude feels peaceful. They enjoy the quiet. They enjoy not having to explain themselves. They enjoy the freedom of not being emotionally responsible for anyone else. But as time goes on, something inside them begins to feel different. The silence becomes heavier. The routines become repetitive. The independence that once felt empowering starts to feel empty. But by then, their habits are deeply rooted. Reaching out feels awkward. Emotional conversations feel unnatural. Letting someone get close feels like stepping into unfamiliar territory. And so they stay where they are, even if it doesn't truly satisfy them. With age, their emotional world often becomes smaller, not bigger. They talk to fewer people about their feelings. They invest less energy into relationships. They become more selective, more cautious, more guarded. But it's not always a conscious decision. It's just the natural outcome of years spent choosing safety over closeness. Their mind starts to develop stricter filters. They notice flaws more quickly. They become more critical of others. They convince themselves that no one is truly compatible. No one is worth the effort. No one understands them deeply enough. And this belief protects them from vulnerability. If no one is good enough, then they never have to risk opening up Over time, emotional curiosity begins to fade. In their younger years, there may have been moments where they wondered what love could feel like if they truly allowed it. There may have been times when they almost let someone in, almost took a risk, almost chose closeness. But if those moments ended in discomfort, conflict, or emotional overwhelm, their mind remembers, and the next time something similar appears, they don't lean in. They pull back. They stop asking what if and start assuming the outcome. They expect closeness to lead to pressure. They expect vulnerability to lead to disappointment. They expect relationships to become emotionally demanding. And because of these expectations, they stop exploring connection altogether. This is how the avoidant slowly moves from being guarded to being closed off. In the beginning, their walls have doors. They might open up a little. They might let someone in for a short time. They might share pieces of themselves when they feel safe. But with each passing year, those doors become harder to open. The locks become stronger, the walls become thicker, and eventually, even they forget what it felt like to live without those defenses. Avoidance stops being a strategy. It becomes their identity. They may tell themselves that they simply prefer peace. They may say they're not interested in drama. They may believe they've outgrown emotional intensity. But deep down, there are moments when a quiet thought crosses their mind, a memory of someone they pushed away, a relationship they never fully explored, a chance they didn't take, and for a brief second, they wonder what their life would look like if they had chosen differently. But the thought passes quickly, because regret requires emotional reflection, and emotional reflection feels uncomfortable. So they push the thought away, just like they've pushed away so many feelings before. And this is the hidden truth about avoidance and aging. Time doesn't automatically heal emotional patterns. It doesn't magically make someone more open, more vulnerable, or more connected. If anything, time strengthens whatever patterns a person repeatedly chooses. For the avoidant, years of emotional distance become decades of emotional habit. And habits, once deeply rooted, are incredibly hard to change. What once felt like freedom slowly turns into a quiet kind of loneliness. Not the loud, dramatic loneliness that begs for attention, but a subtle, background emptiness. A feeling that something is missing, even if life looks stable on the surface. They may have their routines, their work, their hobbies, their quiet spaces, but the emotional depth they once avoided is also the very thing that could have made their life feel richer. And the hardest part is this. By the time they begin to notice that emptiness, opening up feels more difficult than ever. The emotional muscles they never used have weakened. The habits of distance have become second nature. And the idea of changing now feels more intimidating than it ever did before. So they stay where they are, telling themselves they're fine, even when a small part of them wonders if life could have felt different. Because avoidance doesn't stay the same as the years pass. It doesn't soften on its own. It grows stronger, more automatic, more ingrained. And unless something interrupts that pattern, the walls only get higher, the distance only gets greater, and the quiet inside their world becomes harder and harder to ignore. And as the years continue to pass, something else begins to fade in the avoidance world, something so subtle that even they rarely notice it. It's their emotional curiosity. There was a time long ago when part of them still wondered what closeness could feel like. There was a time when they allowed themselves to imagine a deep connection, a relationship that felt safe, warm, and consistent. Even if they pulled away from it, the curiosity was still there. The possibility still existed in their mind. But with age, after enough disappointments, enough emotional pressure, enough moments where closeness felt overwhelming, that curiosity begins to disappear. They stop asking what connection could look like. They stop wondering how love might feel if they allowed it. Instead, they start assuming that every deep relationship will end the same way. They expect emotional exhaustion. They expect loss of control. They expect themselves to feel trapped or misunderstood. And once those expectations become fixed in their mind, the world of emotional connection starts to look less like an opportunity and more like a threat. So they begin to live in a smaller emotional world. It's not always obvious from the outside. They may still have acquaintances, colleagues, or casual friendships. They may still go out, laugh, talk, and appear socially functional. But the deeper layers of their emotional life become quieter. They share less. They reveal less. They invest less energy into people. And at first, this feels efficient. It feels like they've learned to protect their peace. They tell themselves they've become wiser, more selective, more emotionally mature. But what's really happening is something different. Their world is shrinking, not in a dramatic way, but in a slow, steady, almost invisible way. The number of people they truly let in becomes smaller. The number of conversations that feel meaningful becomes fewer. And eventually, the space between them and others becomes the most consistent thing in their life. With that distance comes another shift. They begin to see flaws more quickly than they see connection. Where they once might have noticed someone's kindness or warmth, now they notice inconsistencies, habits or behaviors that don't align with their comfort. Their standards become higher, but not necessarily healthier. They start expecting emotional perfection from others. They want someone who never pressures them, never demands too much, never triggers discomfort, never asks them to open up more than they're ready for. But no human being can meet those standards. So one by one, potential connections get dismissed. Not always consciously, and not always harshly. Sometimes it's just a quiet loss of interest, a slow fade, a subtle withdrawal. And each time this happens, it reinforces the same belief that no one is truly compatible with them. What they don't always realize is that these standards aren't just about compatibility. They're about safety. If no one meets their emotional criteria, then they never have to risk vulnerability. If every connection has a flaw, then they always have a reason to stay distant. It becomes a quiet, subconscious strategy, a way to stay alone without ever admitting that being alone feels easier than being emotionally exposed. As they grow older, the idea of starting over emotionally begins to feel heavier. In younger years, relationships may have felt like experiments. There was still time, there was still energy, there was still a sense that life was open-ended, but with age, emotional restarts feel more exhausting. The thought of opening up to someone new, learning their world, adjusting to their presence, and risking emotional discomfort again can feel overwhelming. So instead of taking those risks, they stay in familiar patterns. Even if those patterns feel lonely, they are predictable. And predictability always feels safer than emotional uncertainty. This is when silence begins to take over their emotional life, not just silence toward others, but silence within themselves. They stop reflecting deeply on their feelings. They stop asking themselves what they truly want. They stop exploring their emotional needs. Instead, they focus on routines, responsibilities, and distractions. Life becomes more practical, more structured, more controlled, and while this brings stability, it also creates a quiet emotional emptiness. Because emotions don't disappear just because they're ignored, they just go unspoken. In relationships, this silence can become even more noticeable. If they are with someone, emotional conversations become shorter, more surface level, or completely avoided. They may respond with logic instead of empathy. They may change the subject when things get too personal. They may withdraw into work, screens, or hobbies when emotional closeness is expected. And over time, the other person may stop trying. Not because they don't care, but because they feel the distance. They feel the wall. And when emotional effort isn't met with openness, it becomes exhausting to keep reaching out. But the avoidant often interprets this differently. When the other person stops trying, they may feel a strange sense of relief. The emotional pressure disappears. The relationship becomes quieter, more distant, more comfortable, and they tell themselves this is better, this is healthier, this is peaceful. But deep down, something else begins to grow, a quiet emotional fatigue. Because even though avoidance protects them from emotional overwhelm, it also requires constant effort. It takes energy to suppress feelings. It takes energy to stay distant. It takes energy to keep conversations shallow, to avoid certain topics, to maintain control over emotional closeness. Over time, this effort becomes draining. They may not call it emotional exhaustion. They may not even connect it to their avoidance. They might just feel tired, less motivated, less excited about life, less interested in people. But what they're really feeling is the weight of years spent keeping their emotional world locked down. Avoidance is not effortless. It's a constant, quiet tension between what they feel and what they allow themselves to express. As this emotional fatigue grows, their world often becomes smaller in very practical ways. They invest less time in friendships. They avoid social gatherings that feel emotionally demanding. They choose environments that are predictable and controlled. Their routines become tighter. Their circle becomes smaller. And while this creates a sense of safety, it also reduces the amount of emotional stimulation in their life. Fewer surprises, fewer deep conversations, fewer moments of connection. And without those moments, life can start to feel flat, not painful, not dramatic, just flat. The highs aren't very high. The lows aren't very low. Everything feels steady, neutral, controlled. And they may even convince themselves that this is ideal, that emotional intensity is unnecessary, that calmness is the ultimate goal. But deep down, there's a difference between peace and numbness. And sometimes what they call peace is actually a form of emotional disconnection. There are moments, though, when something breaks through that numbness. Maybe they see a couple laughing together. Maybe they hear about someone rebuilding their life after heartbreak. Maybe they remember a relationship that once felt meaningful. And for a brief moment, they feel something stir inside them, a quiet sense of longing. Not always for a specific person, but for a feeling of closeness, of warmth, of being understood. But that feeling is often quickly suppressed because longing leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability feels unsafe. So they return to what they know, their routines, their independence, their distance. They tell themselves they're fine, that they don't need much, that emotional connection is overrated. And on the surface, their life may look stable, calm, even successful. But underneath that stability, there's often a quiet, emotional emptiness that grows stronger with time. Because the truth is, avoidance doesn't just protect them from pain. It also protects them from joy, from excitement, from deep connection, from the emotional richness that comes with truly letting someone in. And the longer they stay in that avoidant pattern, the more distant those experiences begin to feel. What once felt like a choice slowly becomes a habit, then the habit becomes a lifestyle, and eventually the lifestyle becomes their identity. They're not just someone who avoids emotional closeness, they become someone who believes they were never meant for it in the first place. And that belief, once it takes root, is one of the hardest things to change. And after years of living this way, something even deeper begins to settle inside the avoidant. It's not just distance from others anymore. It becomes distance from their own emotional life. At some point, they stop questioning their patterns. They stop wondering whether their loneliness is a result of their choices. Instead, they begin to see it as proof. Proof that deep relationships don't work. Proof that people are too complicated. Proof that emotional closeness is more trouble than it's worth. Their standards continue to rise, but not in a way that leads them toward healthier love. Instead, their expectations quietly become unrealistic. They may say they're just being selective, that they know what they want now, that they're not willing to settle. But underneath that surface, those high standards often serve a different purpose. They act as a shield, because if no one ever meets their expectations, then they never have to open their heart again. If every potential partner seems flawed, demanding, or emotionally intense, then walking away feels justified. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like wisdom. They begin to look for subtle signs that someone will eventually hurt them, control them, or overwhelm them. A small emotional request becomes a red flag. A desire for deeper conversation feels like pressure. A moment of vulnerability from the other person feels like emotional dependence. And because they interpret these moments as threats, they pull back before the connection ever has a chance to grow. From the outside, it may look like they simply haven't met the right person, but inside, something else is happening. They've created a system where no one can truly fit. Not because people are inadequate, but because closeness itself has become the enemy. And over time, this pattern repeats so often that they stop recognizing it as a pattern. It just feels like reality. As they grow older, another fear begins to take shape, even if they never say it out loud. It's the fear of starting over emotionally. In younger years, there was a sense of time, a sense that relationships were part of the journey, that mistakes were normal, that heartbreak could be survived and new connections would eventually appear. But with age, that sense of openness fades. Emotional risks feel heavier. The idea of beginning a new relationship feels more exhausting than exciting. They think about the conversations they'd have to have, the adjustments they'd need to make, the compromises that would be required, the vulnerability that would be expected, and it all starts to feel like too much effort. So instead of trying, they stay where they are, even if they feel lonely, even if they feel emotionally unfulfilled, because staying in familiar emotional territory always feels safer than stepping into the unknown. Silence becomes more comfortable than connection, not just external silence, but internal silence too. They stop exploring their feelings. They stop asking themselves what they truly want from life or love. They stop imagining different possibilities. Instead, they settle into routines that keep everything predictable. Work, hobbies, small daily habits, familiar environments. Life becomes structured, controlled, and emotionally quiet. If they're in a relationship, the silence can become even more noticeable. Emotional conversations start to feel like interruptions instead of opportunities. When their partner tries to open up, they may respond with logic, advice, or brief reassurance instead of deep emotional engagement. Not because they don't care, but because emotional depth feels uncomfortable. It feels like unfamiliar territory. Over time, their partner may begin to feel the distance. They may sense the emotional wall. They may notice that certain topics always get avoided, certain feelings never get fully acknowledged, and eventually they may stop trying, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. Because constantly reaching out to someone who stays emotionally distant can feel like knocking on a door that never opens. And when that happens, the avoidant often experiences a strange kind of relief. The emotional demands decrease, the relationship becomes quieter, more predictable, less intense, and they may interpret this as improvement, as harmony, as proof that distance works. But at the same time, something else begins to grow inside them, a quiet emotional fatigue. Because even though avoidance protects them from overwhelming feelings, it also requires constant suppression. They're always managing their reactions, always keeping certain thoughts and feelings hidden, always maintaining a level of emotional control, and that takes energy, more energy than they realize. With time, this emotional suppression begins to wear on them. They may not call it exhaustion. They may not even connect it to their avoidance. They might just feel less excited about life, less interested in people, less motivated to form new connections. Everything starts to feel a bit dull, a bit repetitive, a bit empty. Their world becomes smaller, not necessarily in a dramatic way, but in a gradual, almost invisible one. They see fewer people, they talk less about their feelings, they invest less emotional energy into relationships. Their routines become more rigid, their environment becomes more controlled. And while this creates safety, it also reduces the richness of their emotional experience. The excitement that once came with new connections begins to fade. Deep conversations become rare. Moments of emotional intimacy become almost non-existent, and life starts to feel emotionally flat. Not painful, not chaotic, just neutral. And they may convince themselves that this neutrality is a sign of peace, that emotional calmness is the ultimate goal. But there's a difference between peace and numbness. Peace has warmth, peace has connection, peace has meaning. Numbness, on the other hand, feels quiet, but also empty. And sometimes what the avoidant calls peace is actually a form of emotional disconnection they've grown used to. There are moments, though, when the numbness cracks. Maybe they watch others experience deep love. Maybe they hear about someone rebuilding their life after heartbreak. Maybe they stumble across an old memory of a connection that once meant something to them. And for a brief moment, they feel a flicker of something inside, a quiet longing, not always for a specific person, but for the feeling of closeness itself. But that feeling is often short-lived because longing leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous. So they push the feeling away, they distract themselves, they return to their routines, they remind themselves that independence is better. That peace is more important than emotional intensity. And slowly that flicker fades again. With time, their social world continues to shrink. They stop investing in friendships that feel emotionally demanding. They avoid situations that require vulnerability. They choose environments where they can stay in control. Their circle becomes smaller, their interactions more surface level, their emotional life more contained. And this creates a life that is safe, predictable, and quiet, but also one that lacks depth, lacks warmth, lacks the emotional richness that comes from true connection. And even if they don't fully admit it to themselves, there's often a quiet awareness that something is missing. Not in a dramatic, heartbreaking way, but in a subtle, persistent way, like a room that's well organized but feels empty, like a life that's stable but lacks emotional color. And because they've lived this way for so long, they may not even know how to change it anymore. What once felt like a choice has now become a habit. The habit has become a lifestyle, and the lifestyle has become their identity. They're not just someone who avoids closeness, they've become someone who believes closeness was never meant for them. And the longer that belief stays unchallenged, the more real it begins to feel. And at this stage, something very quiet but very powerful begins to settle into the avoidance mind. It's the belief that time has already done its work, that they are simply this way now, that their personality is set, that their emotional patterns are just part of who they are. They may look back at their life and see a consistent thread of distance, independence, and emotional self-reliance. And instead of questioning it, they begin to accept it as their identity. They tell themselves this is maturity, that they've outgrown emotional chaos, that they've learned not to depend on anyone. But what they rarely realize is that time does not heal patterns that are never faced. Time only strengthens what is repeated. If someone spends years opening up, taking emotional risks, and working through discomfort, they often become more emotionally flexible with age. But if someone spends years avoiding vulnerability, suppressing their needs, and staying distant from others, those patterns become more deeply wired. Their mind learns that avoidance is the safest path. Their nervous system becomes accustomed to emotional distance, and what once felt like a strategy becomes a permanent setting. They may believe they've matured out of the need for deep connection. They may say they're more realistic now, that they no longer believe in emotional fantasies, that they prefer stability over intensity. But sometimes what they call realism is actually resignation. A quiet acceptance of a life that feels emotionally limited, not because it's what they truly want, but because it's what feels familiar. There are moments, though, when the past comes back into their thoughts. Certain relationships stand out. Not all of them, but a few. The ones that felt deeper than the rest. The ones that stirred something inside them. The ones that made them feel both drawn in and terrified at the same time. These were the connections that felt too real, too close, too emotionally intense. At the time, those relationships may have triggered something deep inside them. Old fears, old wounds, old beliefs about closeness being dangerous. And instead of leaning into those connections, they may have pulled away, they may have created distance. They may have convinced themselves the relationship wasn't right, or that the other person was too emotional, too demanding, or too intense. But years later, those memories sometimes return in quiet moments. Not with dramatic regret, but with a soft, lingering thought. A question that never quite goes away. What would have happened if they stayed? What would that relationship have become if they hadn't pulled back? What would their life look like now if they had chosen closeness instead of distance? They rarely talk about these thoughts. They rarely share them with others, because acknowledging them would require emotional honesty. It would require admitting that some of the loneliness in their life isn't just bad luck or poor timing. It may be the result of choices they made to protect themselves, and that realization can feel uncomfortable. So instead, they often keep those memories tucked away. They may think about them late at night or during quiet moments when life slows down, but by morning, the routine returns. The structure, the independence, the emotional distance, and the thoughts fade back into the background. As they grow older, another fear often takes hold, even if they never put it into words. It's the fear of emotional dependence. Not just being close to someone, but needing someone, relying on them, trusting them with their emotional world. To the avoidant, dependence often feels like a loss of control. It feels like giving someone the power to hurt them, disappoint them, or trap them in expectations they can't meet. And this fear tends to grow stronger with age, not weaker. Because the longer they've lived independently, the more unfamiliar emotional dependence feels. The more they've built a life centered around their own routines, their own space, and their own control, the harder it becomes to imagine sharing that with someone else. So they maintain distance. They keep relationships at a level where they never feel too exposed. They avoid situations where someone might rely on them too deeply, or where they might feel the urge to rely on someone else. And while this gives them a sense of control, it also limits the depth of their connections. Over time, something else begins to shift inside them. Their emotional reactions become less intense, not because life has become easier, but because they've trained themselves not to feel too deeply. Excitement becomes muted, passion becomes rare, even joy can start to feel subdued. Life becomes calmer, but also flatter. They may tell themselves this is peace, that they've reached a stage in life where they're no longer controlled by emotions. But deep down, there's often a quiet awareness that something is missing, that the highs and lows of emotional connection, while sometimes painful, also made life feel more alive. Instead, they exist in a kind of emotional neutrality. Nothing hurts too much, but nothing excites them deeply either. Relationships feel manageable, but rarely transformative. Conversations feel comfortable, but rarely meaningful. And this emotional apathy slowly becomes their normal state. At this point, avoidance is no longer just something they do, it becomes who they believe they are. They start to tell themselves stories about their identity, that they're just not the emotional type, that they've always been more independent, that deep relationships were never really for them. These beliefs become part of their self-image. And the longer they repeat these stories, the more real they feel. Change starts to seem impossible. They may look at younger people taking emotional risks, falling in love, opening up, and part of them may feel disconnected from that world, like it belongs to someone else, like it's a chapter of life that never truly belonged to them. But beneath that identity, there is often a quieter truth, a part of them that still remembers what connection felt like, a part of them that still carries the memory of warmth, closeness, or emotional safety, even if it was brief. That part never fully disappears. It just becomes quieter over time. And sometimes, in very still moments, that quiet part of them wonders if things could still be different, if it's too late to open up, if the walls they've built are permanent, if the distance they've maintained for so long can ever be replaced with something warmer, something deeper, something more alive. Because even though avoidance grows stronger with age, the need for connection never truly disappears. It may become buried, it may become quiet, it may hide behind routines, independence, and emotional control, but it remains there, waiting. A small, quiet part of the heart that still longs for closeness, even after years of distance. And that is the hidden truth about why avoidants often seem to get worse as they grow older. It's not because they want to be alone, it's not because they don't care about connection, it's because the habits of avoidance become stronger with time, and the longer those habits last, the harder they are to break. But somewhere deep inside them, beneath the routines, beneath the walls, beneath the identity they've built around distance, there is still a part that remembers what it feels like to be close to someone. And that part, no matter how quiet it becomes, never completely disappears.